Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you today on the shoot down of MH17 and the search for justice. Our panelists are extremely well informed on the subject. We have Michael Bachurkiw, who is an international independent analyst, global analyst. We have Alina Zerkal, a former deputy foreign minister of Ukraine and a current advisor to the CEO of Naftogaz in Ukraine. And we have Christo Groziev, who is the lead Russian investigator at Bellingcat, a company which has done terrific work in the social media space on this and other issues. I'd like to start the conversation by turning to Michael. Michael, you were with the OSCE when the shootdown occurred, and you arrived at the scene shortly after the shootdown. What happened there, and how did this crisis develop in the months that followed?
Good morning, everyone from British Columbia. Thank you, Ambassador. Good to be here with you. Yes, I was part of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine at the time in July 2014. And we had first heard about the crash, where else but via Twitter. And it quickly became clear that it was a passenger airliner that came down. And I have to say, Ambassador, for me personally, it was very chilling because a spokesperson I publicly warned about the presence of manpad weapons in rebel-held territory at the time, and that it could pose a danger to civil aviation. We were told by the U.S. Embassy at the time that that was a possibility. Anyway, so we arrived less than 24 hours after the plane went down. There was some negotiation the night before in Kiev with the relevant parties. And the first thing, of course, that we saw was that trademark Malaysia Airlines logo on the tail fin lying quietly in the field. It was really a surreal scene, complete chaos. The area was in control of a small group of pro-Russian fighters who didn't seem to know what they were doing. They were very belligerent, very unhelpful, and some of them we detected were intoxicated. And a lot of you who saw the footage from the crash site may remember one particularly menacing man whose nickname was Grumpy. He was in charge of the whole area, and he famously hoisted that toy puppet on his bayonet, which didn't go over very well around the world, as you can imagine. Anyway, that first day we were only there 75 minutes, but that time in the area increased day by day as more negotiations took place, and then eventually a new group of managers, if we can call them, also heavily armed, came, and then body bags were produced, and then the bodies were collected and eventually put on a train to Kharkiv and on to the Netherlands. It did take some time, I must say, for Dutch and Australian investigators to arrive at the scene. We were getting a bit restless because it did, but they did come and they did a very, very good job. And of course, our job as the OSCE at the time was to facilitate access for experts and also to, of course, report to 57 member states exactly what we saw. So in fact, we were the eyes and ears of the world for those first few days and for weeks to come. I also did many press briefings every day to keep the families and keep the world informed on site, and also in Donetsk, and via social media posts and hundreds of interviews. It actually took months before the debris would be collected, but there was enough debris collected over those months with OSCE help for investigators to be able to reconstruct a large percentage of the aircraft. In fact, the numbers are staggering. About 8,000 fragments of debris was collected, and an estimated 800 bow-tie-shaped pieces of shrapnel, which of course came from the missile, each of them the size of a bullet. And that missile, by the way, the Buk missile, was detonated 10 feet away from the window of the pilot. There were 102 holes in the window of that cockpit. Once that shrapnel hit, the plane continued to fly for another minute and a half. And when everything was kind of desegregated, there was a 500-mile wind and minus 40-degree temperatures at that altitude at the time. I should also say that if we fast forward a bit, at the end of the day, of the 298 crew and passengers, 296 were identified. there were no remains whatsoever. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that there was a crash zone where the temperature from the fire where the fuel tanks came down reached 1600 Celsius. So a lot of vaporization there. I have to say that the Dutch investigators did an incredible job, assisted by Australia and other countries, including in terms of collecting debris, of course, collecting remains, collecting tap phone calls via the Ukrainian SBU, triangulation of phone towers, witness testimony, third-party evidence, especially via Bellingcat, and then communication with the families. To finish off this segment, I wanted to paint a little bit of a quick human face on one of the families that was really affected by this. Samira Taylor was a mother who put her two sons on board MH17 on July 17th in Amsterdam to visit their grandmother in Bali. One was 19 years old, and the youngest, Miguel, was 11. At the airport, Samira said, my son held me really tightly and said, Mom, I'm so afraid to take this plane. What will happen if it crashes? The mother said, come on, Miguel, you've been on flights so many times. Everything will just be fine. He said to me, you promise me? She said, I promise everything will be okay. And then the mom, it was just broadcast the other day, said to a television audience around the world, I can't forgive myself that I promised my baby boy McGill that everything will be fine aboard that flight. Who am I to give that guarantee? I feel like I lied to him. It's been like hell. There's a hole in my heart. I miss them every day. So I've got to know a lot of the relatives in the process of working on this case, and then I've been to almost every memorial service for the anniversary. And I'd like everyone to know, to realize that this search for justice is crucially important, because all the families want is to know who gave that order to fire the Buk missile. And of course, the thing they want is for the perpetrators to be brought to justice. And if there's time later on, I'd like to draw some similarities between this crash and PS 752 over Tehran and what lessons should have been learned. Thank you.
Thank you. Christo, the shootdown was in July of 2014, 6 years ago. Bellingcat was perhaps one of the principal, maybe the principal investigator that made clear the Russian hand in this. Yet it took 5 years for Dutch authorities to bring charges. Why do you think that is? And what can you say about the defendants? Who are they, and what can you say about them?
Thanks, Ambassador. Well, first of all, I think it's not a fair comparison. These are completely different trajectories of investigation. We did it from the point of view of an investigative online platform that was very fresh and young at the time we launched. All we had to do is try to come to a level of certainty in the facts that would be sufficient for us to stake our reputation on the line. And the moment we found evidence for each of the steps in the investigation that gave us comfort that we could put our name behind it, we would publish it, because for us it was important to not only to get to the ultimate truth eventually, but to deliver the truth as fast as possible to the audiences, because a truth delayed 6 or 7 years would essentially be truth denied and justice denied. Whereas for the joint investigation team, they had a completely different goal. They couldn't live with most likely truth. They had to actually get the evidence right. They had to get all the alternative scenarios investigated in full, so that not only would it stand in court, but not a single of the family members of the killed people and passengers would ever doubt the outcome of the court verdict. So it's a completely different level of thresholds. You could compare it from American justice point of view as the different thresholds between a criminal verdict, which has to be beyond any reasonable doubt, and a civil verdict where you have to be convincingly and overwhelmingly convinced. Each of the evidence pieces that has been reviewed has a completely different trajectory for us to publish that in a report versus the joint investigation team. Take, for example, a social media photograph or a video of somebody uploading the boom teller, the weapon of choice that was moving along the way from Russia, from Kursk to Snizhne. For us, it would be sufficient to find that original poster, to find the actual original posting of that photograph, and to be sure that it was not post-dated, that it was posted at the right time, at the right place, before anybody could manipulate data post-factum. and we would be ready to publish a report based on that finding. For the Joint Investigation Team, that was only the beginning of their search for the actual piece of evidence. They would have to find the original person who posted it. They would have to interview that person, debrief them, and get the original metadata from that report. So it's a completely different approach. 6 years is probably not a long enough or too long of a stretch of time, because this is by far the most difficult investigation that I've witnessed in my career as a journalist. This is something that was done on hostile territory. This was done with continuous denial from and refusals from the party that controls the territory, Russia, to deliver evidence. It took 2 years to deliver, for us to hand over even the original radar that they claim is the only radar they have. So working in such environment, I mean, 6 years is really not a long stretch of time. The culprits, or the ones that are currently indicted, there are 4 of them, and they're all people who were militants on the ground at the time of the shootdown. None of them is actually up very high in the chain of command, and none of them represents the parties that delivered the weapon to Russia, to Ukraine, to Eastern Ukraine. The 4 suspects that are indicted include Igor Girkin, the self-appointed head of the army of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk Republic at the time. One of his deputies, the head of the local military intelligence, Sergei Dubinsky. One of his deputies, Oleg Polatov, who's the only person who's represented by a lawyer in court at the moment. All of these 3 are Russian citizens who chose to, or were sent to actually fight illegally on Ukrainian territory at the time. And the 4th one is the only Ukrainian, that's Leonid Harchenko, with call sign Krot. He's the only Ukrainian, and his background, unlike the others, was not in military or intelligence services. He was a local criminal who was co-opted by the other 3. Interestingly, and just I would end on that, looking at the background of the other 3, one of them is a former colonel from the FSB who was retired a year before the events, before the shutdown of MH17, but retained his very close-knit network with FSB officers to whom we reported. And the other 2 were former GRU, military intelligence officers from Russia, who again retained their own contacts to Russian military intelligence.
Thank you. I'd just like to mention, of course, I was following this closely 6 years ago. And I remember that same morning when the shootdown occurred, Girkin posted that they had shot down a Ukrainian military plane. And they only removed that post, I don't know, a day or 2 later.
Well, Girkin says that it's not him. It was a social media account of the local rebellion that posted on his behalf. But you don't have to go that far to actually find evidence, because until this very day, until this very moment, on Russia's state news agency, TASS, you would still find the news that is posted in English and in Russian at about 5 p.m. on that afternoon, 5 p.m. European time, which says, rebels just shot down a Ukrainian An-26 plane. That's still there.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. All right, Aliena, what has Ukraine done to help focus international attention on the Kremlin role in this, and to help the Dutch criminal investigation, or the Dutch-Australian criminal investigation?
Just right now, I have a feeling that I'm again in that time. It was a terrible time, and we were absolutely shocked. It was such a disaster we couldn't imagine before. And we all worked 24 hours, 7 days per week, and we managed to organize all processes in accordance with international law. And we concluded 2 agreements in that particular moment, which gave the possibility to investigators to come to Ukraine, and we transfer investigation powers to the Dutch authorities. I think that was the wisest decision from all point of views, despite the fact that Russians accused Ukraine in this tragedy, and they presented so many scenarios. But from the very beginning, for us, it was obvious that we should be transparent, and we should prove that this happened not because of Ukrainian faults. And definitely for us, it was very difficult to organize all the processes in that particular moment. We did not have access to this territory. We could not prove the safety of the investigators. And not only this was the main challenge. Of course, the main challenge was to organize all these transfers of bodies, of rests, and all the things related to the crash. And of course, coming back to that particular situation in 2014, I have to say that nobody from the psychological point of view was ready for this disaster. And also for the Dutch investigators, it was a kind of big problem to deal with all authorities, with necessity to organize processes, but at the end we managed to organize ourselves and to prove that we can work together. We gave all necessary equipment and all necessary assistance to the investigators in order to manage the process and to prepare the case for the court, despite all complications, despite the fact that parts from the site were stolen by Russian-led rebels, despite the number of scenarios, despite of number of claims and propaganda. And you can't imagine how it was difficult then to start any kind of official process with Russian Federation concerning their role in this tragedy. We first sent our diplomatic note, I think, a week after the tragedy, where we asked Russians to explain their role and to provide all necessary information concerning the situation and the fact they can be in the possession. But then we started an official process of negotiation concerning the break of the international law and their role on financing of terrorism, because definitely for us, it was an act of terrorism, and it's still an act of terrorism. We accused Russians on the ground of information we had, and I have to thank Billingcat, because they were first who helped us in obtaining this information, who helped us to start negotiation processes with Russians and to engage them in this process, despite their unwillingness to accept the fact of their participation in this tragedy. And then we based our case in International Court of Justice on the ground of the materials we got from Billingcat, but we also used materials from investigation, and we cooperated very good with Dutch authorities in order to provide necessary materials to the court. And that gave us all the legitimacy. And we used not only one way of proofs, we managed to present a number of ways of proofs. And that's a kind of common work which actually gave a possibility to Dutch authorities and also to Australians to start their negotiation process with Russians, to claim that Russia should accept their role in this tragedy. And I think that a teamwork, which firstly did not let Russians to escape any responsibility and liability. However, they still continue to play this game, catch me if you can. And I don't think that this is an end of the game. I do believe that we will see a lot of other attempts to escape responsibility. But in the end, all sanctions were possible only because of the common position of the international community on this tragedy. And that was the beginning of the unity. That what unified different kind of countries and political forces, and that what give us a possibility to present our case in the International Court of Justice.
Well, I think you're right that Ukraine has been very active and, generally speaking, effective on this. But one issue where there was some controversy was the decision taken late last year in the prisoner exchange with Russia to send back Volodymyr Semach. And this happened before Dutch authorities had the opportunity to question him. Any thoughts you have on why this decision was taken in Kyiv?
I think that it was a provocation. And I definitely was against this idea to exchange Semach and to have him in list of the participants of this exchange. But it was a decision of the current president that he is not an important for the justice and that it's not a big price for the return of our prisoners. I can't comment concerning the background of this decision, but I do think that the president had this lesson and he now knows better how to deal with Russians, and that he can't rely on their honesty. And definitely for the bilateral relations with Netherlands, it was a very negative moment. And after that, we had a decision of the parliament, Dutch parliament, to start a kind of research concerning the Ukrainian position on the closure of the sky in that particular moment, or other aspects related to the technical investigation, which already been conducted years ago. I think that they did it purposely in order to destroy the coalition, in order to destroy the trust. That was the main purpose.
Okay, thank you. Michael, what do you see as the possible outcomes to the trial, which we're now told may not be evident for another 6 months?
Sure. Well, first of all, I was at the start of the trial in early March in the Netherlands. I'm accredited to the court as a journalist, and I have to say one of the most somber moments there was that when the Dutch prosecutor started the trial by naming all of the names of the 298 souls who died aboard MH17. It took a total of 18 minutes to read all of those names. So you can imagine what kind of moment that was for everybody, including all the journalists and family members there. In terms of the outcome, well, from what I've seen from far away, it's been a start, stop, start type of process. One of the key suspects, Polotov, I believe, is being bankrolled by the Russian Federation. They've hired a very expensive Dutch defense team who are poking holes through the case of the prosecution. And the one tact I found, to pick up on what Alana was saying too, is that the issue of the airspace remaining open. As you know, the airspace was closed up to about 32,000 feet. That airliner, as well as dozens of others passing through that day, were at around 34,000 feet. So in order to kind of compromise, if you will, the credibility of Ukrainian evidence, including phone taps, that type of thing, they're saying, how can you trust a participating party like Ukraine if they couldn't even handle the airspace properly? So it's a typical Russian tactic of trying to poke holes, but also putting forth disinformation and fog. This trial will go on for a long time. COVID-19 has caused some delays. It's also prevented from some families from attending, but we suspect it'll go on well into next year. But it also should be noted, a couple of things here, is that there are civil trials going on demanding compensation from the Russian Federation. And also in the past few days, the Dutch have initiated a case at the European Court of Human Rights. According to the foreign minister, what the Dutch government is trying to do is to support the individual lawsuits that more than 400 relatives of the passengers on board have filed. Another quick fact here is, I think Olana mentioned this as well, is the Russians have been anything but cooperative in the investigation and in the trial. Things like primary radar data haven't been handed over, and a lot of the information they have handed over has been a very dubious quality. So I do believe justice will be served. But if I can end with this, Ambassador, is that look, whenever shooting down or an accident of this magnitude happens, it's very tragic, but it's also really, really important that lessons be learned. All of us travel a lot, or did travel a lot, and it's really important to put in place as an international community measures that will prevent this from happening again. And I mentioned PS 752 earlier. Well, there are a lot of similarities between the two. It involved a Russian built missile as well. And as I told BBC World at the time, this was yet another civilian airline tragedy with Russian fingerprints all over it. But what happened in that particular case over Tehran with that Ukrainian airliner is the airspace wasn't closed. And it was up to, of course, Iran to have closed that airspace, have closed the airport. They didn't. I have to say the operator, Ukrainian International Airlines, should have taken, I think, a bit more effort to find out what the environment was on the ground. And then finally, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, a UN body based here in Canada. The last time I saw, they updated their guidance for airlines and for countries in 2018. They need to take measures quickly to make sure that states, that airline operators, that airport operators all know that when there's a conflict going on, you don't allow planes to land or take off. You don't allow them to fly over or around that conflict zone. So that's my take.
Okay, thank you. Christo, what has the Kremlin reaction first to the charges and then the trial been?
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to just add something to what Mike said, and then I'll transition to this question, which is about the actual outcome of the trial and the progress of the trial, because two things I'd like to mention. First of all, we should be aware of the fact that this is not the final criminal trial. This is a trial of the four suspects that were immediately involved with organizing the procurement of the book teller and the shoot down. However, under Dutch law, the prosecutors are obligated to pursue the chain of command and to get to not to everybody who was involved with the decision to provide such a completely irresponsibly dangerous weapon to people who obviously don't know how to use it even in warfare. And this means that the Dutch investigation or the Dutch-led investigation team is obligated to go up into the military chain of command. And they've already stated that once this particular juncture is reached of the indictment and the prosecution of these four suspects, and the investigation is completed into their responsibility, then they will proceed up the food chain, and this will go as high as it has to. So this is very important to keep in mind when we are considering Kremlin's reaction, and that's why it was important to mention this. Another thing I'd like to also mention was that it was somewhat of a surprise that Pulatov, one of the four suspects, engaged or was given a law firm to defend him. One of the strategies that we had seen being planned by Russia, by the Kremlin for this court case, was to try to deplete it of its international legitimacy. And to do that, part of the evidence we were looking at in terms of leaked emails and correspondence and source information was that Russia was planning to not allow any of the suspects to show up with a defendant, with a defense team, in order for Russia to always be able to say, well, it was just a kangaroo court where the court decided without even listening to the other side. Now, for whatever reason, Russia decided to fund or authorize the defense for Pulatov. And this already is working against the Kremlin, because we're seeing all of these prevarication from the defense team, or a lot of unnecessary requests for additional investigation, such as interrogating witnesses who claim with their naked eye to have seen an airplane shoot, another airplane. That's one of the many false narratives that the Kremlin has been spreading, that there was a Ukrainian fighter jet that was shooting at MH17 with a machine gun. So there were tens of witnesses that claimed that they've seen the actual Ukrainian plane shoot a missile at 10 kilometers above sea level, which is completely impossible from a technical point of view. The defense team wanted the investigation to go and interview all of these people that are clearly lying or confused. But in any case, this is all for the better, because at the end it will be a very, very legitimate outcome of the court, where all of the counter evidence has been presented as well and looked at. In terms of the Kremlin's attitude, what we're seeing at the moment is, on one hand, a sort of a state of denial. Russian audiences get only the snippets from the Hague court that can be played to mean the opposite of what they mean. For example, last week, after the court decided to not allow most of the requests for additional investigation by the defense team, but to allow a couple of additional things that they did ask. So the ratio of things that were permitted for further investigation versus such that were not was about 90 to 10. But Russian-controlled media, or Russian state-controlled media, published headlines such as the court has agreed with Russia's position, and everything will have to be reinvestigated from scratch. So it's a mixture of completely falsification of facts versus keeping quiet about any outcome from The Hague that is not to the pleasing of the Kremlin. So that's the traditional, to be expected reaction.
We had an event at the Atlantic Council a few months ago before the COVID crisis hit, and a very smart Russian journalist, Konstantin Yeger, thought that, in fact, if the results of the trial are that, yes, these gentlemen did it, it was a Russian operation, the impact in Russia will be significant. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, that is definitely so. I mean, we can make actually a comparison between the reaction of the Kremlin and the reaction of the Iranian government after the shoot down of the Ukrainian airplane there a couple of months ago. I mean, you have to say that in this particular, at this juncture, the Iranian government acted much more maturely and much more with a sort of a providence of the long-term effect on their country and on their nation, whereas the Kremlin government is looking at solving its today issue and deferring the problem to a future generation, and definitely to a future leadership. So sooner or later, the outcome of the verdict will seep through into the Russian domain, media domain as well, and people will get to the facts. They will hear the witnesses. They will see satellite photos that point to the launch of the missile, because sooner or later, even the American satellite photos that are currently deemed to be too sensitive and confidential to be shared with the court, that will become public sooner or later. So I cannot imagine that in 10 years from now, there'll be a single Russian who will still believe in the conspiracy theory, in any of the conspiracy theories that are spread by Russia. We've counted so far about 42 of them. But that is a problem for the next government, for the next generation of Russians. And the problem with this approach is that the Kremlin is essentially sentencing the current generation into being residents of a pariah state, because Russia will be slapped with additional sanctions after the end of this court case. All of the civil cases will result in additional unfeathered penalties that have to be paid to the families. All of this will be paid out of the pocket of the current population, and they'll be all the angrier whenever they find out that the government has lied to them. So it's a very, very immature decision by the Kremlin to just keep lying.
Thank you. Alena, it has been a long time, 6 years since the shoot down. As Christo pointed out, he thinks that the Dutch have needed this time to investigate this thoroughly. But some people are concerned that realpolitik may take precedence over justice, and that the ultimate decision may not be satisfactory to those seeking justice. My question for you is, what does Ukraine expect from this trial?
I think that you just mentioned the point of view of Russians. They do rely on impunity.
Right.
But I think that we are now in the position where we have at least 3 public hearings on this particular matter. We have already heard Russian position and Ukrainian position in The Hague. We now have this close to The Hague in the Hague District Court. And I hope that we will also have a public hearings in Strasbourg. But definitely, this is only the beginning. Again, coming back to 2015 and the attempt to create the special tribunal on MH17 downing also showed that it's only Russia who used its right of veto. And you might remember the accusation of Churkin we heard in New York in summer 2015, when he mentioned that it was Ukrainian false and that we did not provide some data from our radars. They don't hesitate and they lie all the time. And I do think that for the world, it's obvious that the continuation of this lie may create another problems and that the justice couldn't be deniable. We have to prove that all these losses, they're not for nothing, and that those who are responsible in this tragedy, they should be accountable. And I think that for Dutch authorities and for others, this is a matter of their main concern. I can't say anything about Malaysian position because they continue to present two different views on the expert level and on the political level, but it's mainly because of their dependence on Russians and their political vulnerability. That's the main reason, because at the expert level, we continue very good cooperation and they always were very supportive. And I don't think that they are not in line with the position of the investigation team. And definitely for Dutch authorities, it's also a matter of their dignity to prove their professional views and not to let Russians further discredit the investigation.
Okay, thank you. Your last point about Dutch dignity, I think, is an interesting one. As someone very much involved in the international battle for Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Kremlin aggression more broadly, you know that the Dutch position after the Russians seized Crimea, even after the war began in Donbass, was rather weak. They were against sanctions. Even in April of 2016, you remember you had the Dutch referendum, which called into question the trade deal, the EU trade deal with Ukraine. Although, to be fair, the Dutch political leadership was strong in backing the trade agreement in Brussels, despite that referendum, in my judgment. Anyway, my question, it's actually for all of our panelists. What impact has MH17 and the investigation had, if any, into Dutch attitudes on Ukraine and Moscow's war against Ukraine? For example, there are Dutch investors in Nord Stream 2. Any thoughts?
If I could chime in on that, Ambassador. So, look, I've been to the Netherlands many times. As I've said, I've been to many of their memorial events for MH17. And the thing you have to realize is that this is their 9/11. There's hardly, in such a small nation, there's hardly anyone who hasn't been touched by this tragedy. The government knows it, so they know that they have to produce very good evidence and that they have to, put together a bulletproof trial. But the other thing I should say is that I think sometimes it's very difficult to read the tea leaves in geopolitics, but the one thing we found, I mean, what really counts, I think, is what happens on the ground. The one thing we found with PS752 is that the Dutch actually agreed with the Ukrainians that they should be drawn into the investigation in PS752 and share the experience they developed with MH17. That, to me, is a really, really important step, and it shows what international cooperation can do. I had a couple more quick points to add. Something that Christos said about the Iranians, if I may. I'm not so sure I'd call their handling of this first class, but you didn't use that term. But I would say that at the beginning, it was very sloppy handling. I mean, in terms of the debris field, taking a bulldozer and taking it through the debris field and moving bodies that way, and then blocking international investigators. And now we have a situation, it's a very big deal here in Canada, of course, because of the number of victims, is that they're refusing to hand over the black box. We hope that by the end of this week, that black box will be in France, and then international investigators can look at that. Finally, Olena mentioned Malaysia. Prime Minister Mahathir, I don't know what's going on with him. I know him very well. I've written his political obituary, but he is actually taking the Russian side on the MH17 case. And I think she hit it right on, suggesting that there's a very close relationship between Malaysia and Russia. Russia sells a lot of firepower to Malaysia, and they require Malaysian palm oil and stuff like that. But she is right. I've spoken to the Malaysian ambassador in the Netherlands and the investigators, and they shake their head when you repeat some of the things Mahathir has said about the evidence. So hopefully he'll come to his senses and not interfere like he usually does.
Or maybe he's a future career path like Gerhard Schroeder.
Right.
Anyway, okay. We have questions from folks who are in our audience. Valeria Yegisman from Voice of America asked, what are the expectations on the outcome of the European Court of Human Rights case? Also keeping in mind the recent constitutional amendment in Russia about domestic law prevailing over international law. Anyone want to take a shot at this?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I think Netherlands now took this decision to enter the process, because these changes of Constitution of Russian Federation, they don't have now implications on their international obligations. And I think Netherlands decided to use this opportunity and to go forward now, not to delay anymore their actions. But of course, this is more a matter of solidarity with victims and a matter of necessity to prove that Dutch politicians, they're on the same page with relatives, and they do want to support their position in the court. I'm very much concerned about the results, the final results of this case, and how fair they will be, because definitely Russia has the very strange position concerning international justice. At the same time, that's a kind of platform which definitely should be used in order to protect international law. And this move of Netherlands is very reasonable from this point of view.
Okay, Michael or Krista, do you want to jump in on this? Otherwise, I have a follow-up question.
I'd like just to tie this a little bit to your earlier question, which was about the realpolitik expectations of a possible outcome. I mean, that was the realpolitik outcome was the one expected by Russia all these years. They underestimated the Dutch commitment to truth finding and saw them as a seafaring trading nation that would always agree to settle somewhere behind the scenes in return for Russians not withdrawing their money from Dutch banks and so on and so forth. And for the longest time, for a couple of years, that seemed like that might work. But that was only so far as the Netherlands, the Dutch people and politicians saw Russia as an actual reasonable party that may have committed a major crime by allowing this weapon to cross the border and shut down innocent. But sooner or later, they will come clean. The more Russia actually prevaricated and lied and obstructed the investigation, the more this made it impossible for Dutch politicians to actually not take a stand. So it was actually a backfiring strategy by Russia, which resulted in addition to the timing issue that Olena just described, it was just an issue of the Dutch political elite and environment not being able to not act anymore in a very aggressive manner against Russia.
Go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, just quickly on states having to come clean. I think we're in a different situation now too than we were 6 years ago when MH17 came down. In the case of PS752, I think the Iranian government was caught flat-footed. They were painted into a corner. Why? Because there was a lot of social media posts from eyewitnesses right on the ground there. And also don't forget that they did have an active youth protest movement in action, and that because that airplane that went down represented some of the best and brightest of Iranian society, the educated, middle class, young students, is that people were disgusted that actually happened. They really felt it, and they felt the connection. So states are going to be held more accountable these days because of technology, that it's very difficult for them to hide and prevaricate. And I think we even saw that with in China with what happened with COVID and governments trying to hide the facts. Well, despite all of that, censorship stuff still got out. So that's the new era we're kind of living in now.
Okay, let me offer a thought for your consideration. If the Dutch want to use this play to the European Human Rights Court in the most effective way possible, they should suggest that if Moscow refused to abide by its ruling, that the European Parliamentary Assembly should reconsider Moscow's presence there. Just any thoughts on this?
I think this is possible only as the end of the process.
Correct.
Any kind of other actions wouldn't be possible. But we don't know how long the process will take place, because this is interstate process, and it's a very time-consuming process. But definitely what should be, that's a kind of open and transparent process of all evidences that can be presented there, and the use of this platform as a kind of raising of public awareness about this particular case. Definitely, it should be even more broadly presented in Strasbourg than now in the district court, because the district court deals with the criminal investigation. But in the International Court of Human Rights, that's mostly about the Russian inability to comply with the requirements of the convention. And that is another kind of angle of the responsibility. Because you see, this is a kind of blocks we have now. We have now a criminal process. We have the process on international justice in The Hague on the basis of the Convention on the Financing of Terrorism, and also the Human Rights Court. That's a kind of different angles of the same tragedy. And I think that a kind of novelty in this process, because we may see different kind of blocks of responsibility of the state and personalities.
Thank you. Michael, you mentioned at the start of the process in the Netherlands, they read all the names of all 298 victims. We have an anonymous question asking, what is the role of victims' families in the trial beyond what you've already mentioned, Michael?
Sure. Well, of course, number one, they want to witness it firsthand, and because of limitations at the courthouse, it's very difficult for them to actually be in person there. They've had to view it from satellite rooms in Amsterdam. The second one, of course, is testimony. They're very eager to give their own stories of their lost loved ones, how it's affected them. But also there are limitations in terms of how many families can actually appear on the stand. So I think they're trying to group some of their testimony. One of the key factors here in any trial, I think, of this sort is to prove the kind of degree of suffering, if you will. I mentioned at the beginning some of the conditions up there at 34,000 feet when that plane was disintegrating. And my experience from covering previous air crashes is that if it can be proven that the victims did suffer even for a split second, well, that makes a big difference, not only in terms of, especially in terms of compensation. I also wanted to say something else. I think I'm quite worried geopolitically what's happening, especially in the United States, that the US has kind of abdicated its role as the world's policeman. The reason I mentioned that, Ambassador, is that when it comes to actually enforcing any of these types of decisions, for example, if Russia was to be, let's use the word convicted of this or proven to have done it, one avenue, of course, is to seize assets. For example, Aeroflot plane landing at JFK or in Heathrow, that could be a way to kind of claim back some of that compensation, if you will, and that's what's really going to hit them. But without the U.S. actively involved in these types of measures, I'm not so sure the Europeans, for example, could do it all on their own. So that does worry me in the kind of bigger picture.
I understand your point, Michael, and I would just say that if it comes to that development, whatever the inclinations may be, by certain politicians in the United States, I think Congress would move forcefully to make sure that we could play that role. But
Glad to hear that. Yeah.
we'll see. Okay, we have another question. Again, an anonymous question from one of our attendees. The identities of some figures in the trial have been concealed out of concern that Russian intelligence may target them. Have we any public evidence of this, any recent threats of dangers from the Kremlin for witnesses?
If I could take that answer just to begin with, what we do have is, well, we've talked to a lot of witnesses. We've talked to a lot of people that were close to people in the 53rd Brigade, which was exactly the military unit that provided the book. And what we've heard from people, let's say members of the 53rd Brigade, is that they have been subject to extreme threatening by the authorities to not speak. And some of them wanted to speak to us, and definitely to the investigators, but they felt that their families' lives would be at risk if they spoke. So we can expect what threats may have been imposed or directed at any of the bystanders or people who were on the ground and saw it and are currently under Russian-controlled territory. But what I wanted to say as well is that just before the launch of the criminal proceedings in March, there was a series of leaks of internal joint investigation team documents that were published by a Russian-owned media organization that had just been set up a couple of months before that, specifically to quote-unquote investigate independently MH17 from a different angle. And these leaks showed actual internal documents, including interrogation of witnesses. And some of these witnesses were de-anonymized, or at least easy to de-anonymize in these leaks. Our understanding, based on delving into this, the origin, the provenance of these leaks, is that they were not leaks. They were not leaks provided by the Malaysian government, for example, or by some disgruntled employee. These were hacks and not leaks. These were hacks that were organized by Russian security services. And the reason for their publication was none other. I mean, there could be no other reason, because none of the leaks, none of these so-called leaks pretended to show any malignant activity by the joint investigation team. Actually, if anything, they complemented the work of the joint investigation team. But the outcome of these publications was that any potential new witness will think thrice before considering coming forward and becoming a witness, because they will be afraid that their identity might be released. And therefore, there's a general long-term strategy of witness intimidation, both of existing witnesses, of potential witnesses, and of hypothetical ones that we see.
That's really interesting because it's so nuanced. It's a rather clever strategy. Mike, you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly to that, he's right. Chris was right. And at the trial, at the start of the trial, I was there, and the Dutch court told us in a press briefing that yes, indeed, anonymous witnesses had been harassed and threatened. And also the court took a very early decision to use, I guess, extraordinary rules to allow the submission of anonymous testimony and that these witnesses be numbered. So that was a very, very important early decision by the court that testimony be allowed in and used.
Chris, I have a question for you. I'm sorry, Lynn, you want to jump in? Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
We have a special agreement in order to transfer the possibility not only to investigate, but also for the possibility to court to hear these procedures. And we, as states and Netherlands, we made special changes in our legislation in order to make it happen and in order to let the process to start. And definitely in this process, from the early beginning, it was obvious that these witnesses are under tremendous pressure and the intimidation is unavoidable. So that's why they had a special procedure, how they made their statements and how they gave their witness statements. because it was organized specially with an assistance of the court, and the court special investigative judges took all these statements. So that was purposely organized in order to protect these people and in order to make this process possible.
Actually, Michael, you've been following the trial very carefully, but this also to the others as well. Have the defense lawyers been trying to unearth the witnesses, the secret witnesses? Have they been playing that game? I see Christo.
Christo might have more on this, but as far as I can see, not when I was there at the trial monitoring it, but he might have some more updated information.
Oh, in their last session, which was in the beginning of July, there was an actual attempt to de-anonymize as many as possible of the witnesses, and that's, of course, they did it with careful wording by saying they're conscious of the perceived risks, but they still want to get as many of them to testify in court. Bringing anybody to testify in Dutch court on a particular date, even if they're completely anonymized, would endanger that person, simply because, I mean, if that's somebody traveling from Russia, well, the Russian government and secret services would know that somebody's arriving particularly for that particular moment in time. If it's somebody coming from Kiev, it will be the same thing. So that's why the prosecution has insisted, and the court has so far accepted, that even in cases when additional hearings or interrogations, questionings is the right word, of witnesses has to take place, it will take place at undisclosed locations by an investigative judge without the presence of even the prosecution or the defense team. They can submit questions in the same way that, Ambassador, you're getting questions from the audience at the moment, but they cannot be present there. And this is strictly to protect the actual witnesses.
Okay, thank you. Then, do you want to jump in on this? No. Okay. Last question. Krista, this is for you. How have Russian media been playing the trial? Are they paying a lot of attention to it or not so much? What's going on there?
They've been paying minimum attention. They've been paying attention with somewhat of a delay. Now, Russia Today, for example, it has its own sort of live streaming service called Ruptly, and they broadcast the trial live. So they're showing a sort of a sign of openness and saying, well, we have nothing to hide.
But if you look, it's not for the Russian people themselves.
Exactly, that's for the international audience. But for the Russian people, you would get the news with a delay of about 24 hours after a strategy has been chosen for what the Kremlin wants to be the main narrative. Now, this does not go for the independent, truly independent or semi-independent Russian media who are following but the problem is that they speak to the choir, they speak to people that already are following also international news, and they know what the actual truth is. So unfortunately, 80% of the population or more is getting a delayed, on delay version of events after it has been filtered by Russian intelligence services or the government.
And also, just quickly, Ambassador, if I can, I noticed at the start of the trial, the Russians did send a investigative TV team to the trial. This is a group of people who used to work at Russia Today, quite high up, and now they're kind of masquerading as an independent media body. They've gone to Malaysia, they've interviewed Mahathir, but very, very one-sided, as you might expect. But seems they're quite well funded, and they even, I think, have Dutch citizens working for them. So that's the type of game they're playing there as well.
Sure, thank you. Okay, I'd like to thank all of you, Lena, Krista, Michael, for your participation. Oh, did anyone jump in? Okay, last words to you.
What is still very interesting is that Russia invests so many efforts and funds in creation of the parallel reality. They started from all these presentations from Altay Almaz concerning the book missile system launching. They continue with different kind of versions and presentation in the different forums, including Security Council. And now they have to delay for 24 hours any kind of news in order to interpret them in their own manner.
You sure? In fact, let me end this session on an upbeat note. In late July of 2014, I was in Berlin talking to a senior German official. And of course, Germany at that point was not very strong on sanctions. But this official said to me, well, you know, watching how the Russians, meaning since the Russians were in control of the area where the shoot down took place, watching how they treat the dead, we just shudder about how they treat the living. And certainly that was an indication of how Germany moved in the right direction on sanctions. So thank you, Elena. Thank you, Hristo. Thank you, Michael, for being part of this event. And we will be doing more on MH17 as there are developments in the future. I thank everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.